The assassination of Charlie Kirk parallels recent acts of political violence. Plus, multiple federal appeals courts uphold gun-free zone mandates. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The Reload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. To kick things off for us this week, we wanted to do just a little bit on the latest in obviously what was quite a grim week in terms of political violence, gun violence, whatever you want to call it. The high-profile assassination of Charlie Kirk, the political activist on a college campus. As of shortly before we're starting to record here, there's been an announcement that they have someone in custody, a person of interest in custody. They've released a suspect's name. And now I think we're all at a point where we're starting to, learn a little bit more about what might have been the motivating factors behind this attack, and starting to look forward to what exactly will be the fallout from this incident.
Yes, I wrote a piece in the newsletter this morning that discusses the potential connection between this assassination and the last major one we saw, the United Healthcare CEO murder back in December, and how those two connect to the connection between those two sort of may imply one of the things that I was worried about after that United Healthcare shooting, which is that it may become something akin to Columbine in its effect and its influence on other shooters down the line, because for a number of reasons. And the connection that I saw, immediately was related to the reports. There were early reports of messages being engraved or written on the ammunition used in this assassination, and there was some confusion about exactly what those messages were. But the law enforcement and Governor Cox of Utah have confirmed now that there were writings. They were political in nature, and I guess they were anti-fascist, I guess you would call them. I think one of the phrases was "Hear fascist, catch." So it does, unfortunately, look in that way, and in the highly public way that this assassination was carried out, to have at least indirect connections to what the United Healthcare shooter did. I talk a little bit more about it in the piece at length, and why that's so concerning. But essentially it boils down to years after Columbine, we're still seeing the influence of that attack. I mean, even this week we saw another school shooting the same day as Charlie Kirk's murder. But similarly, after the United Healthcare shooting, we had a school shooting there where the shooter, who was 15, made references directly to the Columbine shooters. But even sort of basic stuff that you'll see, like manifestos, those were not common before the Columbine shooting. It really created a certain playbook for school shooters and mass killers in particular. And the concern is that what happened with the United Healthcare shooting may have a similar effect, and that may be part of what we're seeing in this Kirk assassination, is some of the same traits repeated here. And it's not that the United Healthcare shooting was the first time we've seen somebody write messages on their ammunition or do other performative actions as part of their attack, but that was also true in Columbine. Columbine was not the first school shooting. It was not the first even that year, but it was one that has been continually referenced ever since due to a combination of factors as described by researchers that we've had on our podcast before, the Violence Project. Professor James Densley has been on our show. And, I think they identified Columbine as sort of a key attack in a key moment where media was changing. And a lot of that seems like it could be true of the United Healthcare shooting as well. And this assassination may be an indicator of that influence. We'll have to see and learn more. It's still very early, of course. And I don't want to get too far over my skis on any of this stuff right now, but that was what came to mind when I heard of at least some of these early details. And we'll actually be talking a lot more about this, and as well as the political violence with David French, who had a very good piece on political violence in the New York Times this week. He'll be on the interview podcast, so we'll discuss the murder in more detail there and what it means for our country beyond just this, and for the gun rights movement, I think, as well, and some of the ways that we discuss political violence in the gun rights movement. So tune in for that for a little more in depth on the assassination. But there is also we saw some of the political side of this, which is, an unfortunate thing to be discussing after horrible attacks like this, or like the Colorado high school shooting, or any number of shootings. But this is what we cover, right? Gun politics and policy here. And we did see, of course, the Charlie Kirk was somebody who was aligned or allied with a lot of the gun rights groups, and they expressed their condolences after his murder. From pretty much every gun rights group put out a statement to that effect after he was killed. But we also saw, as we often do in the wake of these sorts of high profile acts of gun violence, statements from the gun control groups, right? And it's, their immediate effort was to advocate for stricter gun laws as a response to this. But one of the other facts that we know is what the gun used here was, and it's probably not one that's going to, the circumstances of this are not likely to lead to any sort of sweeping new gun hardware ban, right? Because just give us some of the details of what we know about the gun, I guess.
That's right. Yeah. So I don't know if it's exactly been confirmed the make of the gun, but there's been some speculation. But we have at least law enforcement released photos of the gun recovered, and it was essentially a bolt action 30 caliber rifle. So basically your typical scoped, deer rifle that you'd find in many, gun safes across the country. And it's one that, is very commonly available, even in the most gun controlled countries on the planet. This is something that folks can purchase in England and in European countries and Canada. It's not one that's exactly ripe for the, common policies that are offered after these types of incidents. Like you mentioned, we saw statements from the gun control groups. We saw statements from some political figures. I know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democratic representative from New York, was saying that she was asked to respond to the incident, and she said that, we need to do something about guns. It's finally time to do something about guns. And sort of as you tease, this is just not one that seems to be, it's still early. Maybe there's some thing we don't know about this individual's past that should have prevented him from being able to purchase the gun in the first place. We don't even know how he acquired the gun at this point in time. So, that might become something that comes up in discussions in the future. But in terms of the actual hardware itself, this is not something that lends itself to the typical magazine ban or, quote unquote, assault weapon ban policy prescription. And the same is true, unfortunately, of the Evergreen shooting, as you teased, the Colorado shooting. Law enforcement has confirmed that shooter used a revolver. And so it just goes to show that some of these incidents can occur with firearms that are not that are typically put aside as the guns that everyone is okay with folks owning. It's just these other guns we want to focus on, and all guns, quite frankly, can be lethal in the wrong hands.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to fully secure any open area from an attack like this, unfortunately. And so, but again, the weapon used and even the victim's beliefs make it, I think, and the makeup of Congress being Republican controlled, it make it unlikely something like an assault weapons ban is going to gain momentum in the wake of this. Although we have seen, obviously incidents of assassinations lead to new gun control in the past. That was the Gun Control Act of 1968 was in response to a rash of high-profile assassinations. So, well, it's always possible, but I think it's unlikely right now. Either way, we want to offer our condolences to Charlie Kirk's family and the people that cared for him. Certainly nobody deserves to be killed for speaking their beliefs. And given the messaging on the bullets, it sure seems, and the method of carrying out the attack, it does appear that was the goal of this assassin. So that is absolutely unacceptable and horrendous to see. So I just want to offer up those our prayers on that front. But
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It's just, and it's a dark time for our country. And if it is true that this is at least partially or indirectly influenced by what happened in the United Healthcare assassination, there's a lot of things to worry about what this means for our country, but that one in particular for me is what I think of first, that we could see more of these attacks. And that would be just incredibly corrosive to our nation, certainly. So, horrible story to begin with. Two horrible stories, which, by the way, the school shooting as well was one where the attacker used a revolver in that case. So, again, doesn't fit as neatly into the template of how we usually discuss these kinds of shootings. Usually there's a call for specific kinds of guns to be banned, but in both these instances, these are the firearms that tend to be accepted by even gun control activists as not all gun control activists. Of course, some want all guns to be banned, but most of them are advocating for bans on things like AR-15s or other similar firearms. So neither of these incidents fit that mold, but we have some news from the court, from several courts, actually, and two similar cases. One that you wrote about that is coming out of the Third Circuit that deals with New Jersey's sort of Bruin response law, right?
Yeah, that's right. After about 2 years of waiting, we finally have the Third Circuit's ruling on an appeal that was filed from a district court case. The district court in this instance previously ruled that a substantial portion of New Jersey's so-called Bruin response law was likely unconstitutional and blocked it. The Third Circuit put a stay on that and then took 2 years to issue their ruling. And they finally did this week, like you mentioned, and really delivered what I would say is a fairly split ruling for gun rights and gun control activists. The three-judge panel in this case upheld a substantial portion of the locations that New Jersey deems off limits for even licensed gun carriers, the so-called sensitive places. But it also issued an injunction against especially some of the more, I would say, onerous restrictions, like the so-called, what gun rights groups have taken to calling the vampire rule, which is the default swap for publicly accessible private property. New Jersey and California and New York and a lot of these states have taken to adopting a rule that says that if you go into like a restaurant or a store or whatever, unless the owner specifically gives you personally permission to carry, you can't carry there automatically, which sort of flips the typical presumption in most instances where you can, unless they have, they tell you you can't. So the panel in this case ruled that wasn't going to fly. It struck down New Jersey's sort of strange gun insurance mandate requiring up to $300,000 of liability insurance. And it also called into question the policy of banning licensed carry in a person's private vehicle, which is also a fairly onerous outlier, even amongst brew and response laws. So definitely there's something from both sides. And you saw this in the reaction to the ruling from gun rights and gun control advocates, where they cheered aspects of the ruling, but obviously gun rights advocates were not happy to see huge swaths of the state still remain unavailable to licensed carriers.
Yeah, and that the so-called vampire rule or the default swap is one of the only provisions that we've seen consistently struck down by lower courts in these cases.
In fact, only one court has ever upheld the vampire rule, and that was the Ninth Circuit. But every other district judge and then every other appeals circuit has said at least that isn't going to fly going forward.
Yeah, but we've seen a lot of the other sorts of restrictions withstand the scrutiny, at least at these lower level courts. And actually, that was what happened as well in the Seventh Circuit. I wrote two pieces, I guess, about the ruling on Illinois' public transit gun ban. We had, your case was several hundred pages of opinion, right?
Yeah, it was quite long.
Yeah, pretty wild. But they didn't necessarily, it doesn't seem like they necessarily came up with a specific test that's meant to be applied in these cases. They more went on a area by area basis and, did the historical interrogation that way, right? Instead of coming up with a more comprehensive framework, I guess, for how to determine these especially sensitive places bans. That's my impression of it. Is that fair to say for the Third Circuit?
Yeah, they extrapolated a principle, citing Rahimi in its reference to principles that, the Supreme Court has shown that certain polling places and courthouses and schools that they referenced previously that are okay or longstanding sensitive places. So from that, we can sort of extrapolate a principle of core, either a government, location central to the function of government, or location central to what they say are core civic functions. And so from that principle, that can be our general framework. But then, like you mentioned, they went, individual location by location and did analogs for each one, essentially. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess here's the quote that we have from your piece. It says, "Throughout our nation's history, the people have time and time again opted to limit the use of firearms at specific venues set aside for civic purposes, namely government and democratic functions, and public places akin to the fairs and markets of old." That's Judge Sherrill and Krause. "We have done our best to distill the principles of our nation's tradition of firearm regulation from the available historical record, and what we have found convinces us that New Jersey's law, at least in part, continues that tradition." So, they are working from a sort of similar framework as the Seventh Circuit did to uphold the public transit gun ban. Here's the quote from the Seventh Circuit case. It said, this is Judge Joshua P. Kolar. Quote, "The Second Amendment protects an individual right to self-defense. It does not bar people's representatives from enacting laws consistent with our nation's historical tradition of regulation that ensure public transportation systems remain free from accessible firearms." So, similar ethos that they're operating on. But I do think that the Seventh Circuit got a little more in depth in terms of identifying the factors it thinks make a sensitive places restriction. Again, remember, sensitive places like a gun-free zone, it's where even if you have a license to carry from the state that you're in, they can still bar you from these areas. The Supreme Court had said at one point they had identified 4, right? I think it was schools, it was schools, courtrooms. I'm forgetting, looking at the quote here. Schools, courthouses, polling places, and legislative assemblies were the ones that the Supreme Court specifically called out. But the Seventh Circuit went a bit further. It did a similar analysis where it went through the location that it's discussing, which is just the public transit gun ban here, which New Jersey also upheld their public transit gun ban, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But this case is a little less expansive. But they did develop, I think, a more specific test or standard. And here's what they came up with when they were upholding the transit gun ban. They said, quote, a regulation does not offend the Second Amendment because it is consistent with our historical tradition when it, 1, temporarily regulates the manner of carrying firearms, 2, in a crowded and confined space, 3, where that space is defined by a natural tendency to congregate people in greater density than the immediate adjacent areas, 4, that space furthers important societal interests, and 5, the presence of firearms in that space creates a heightened risk to maintaining public safety. So those were the factors that they came up with in terms of, for lower courts. This was a panel in the Seventh Circuit, and they were unanimous on this panel, unlike the Third Circuit, which had a lengthy dissent as well as the lengthy opinion. But yeah, although I will say that they immediately also said that sensitive place doesn't necessarily have to have all those things. They claim that common sense informs the Bruin inquiry, was the quote, and that there could be other places. They specifically pointed to nuclear power plants. Quote, we are not certain that the principles set forth above would apply at all nuclear power plants, and the founding generation, for all their wisdom, had no opportunity to grasp that these facilities would one day exist, let alone decide whether to incorporate them into firearm laws. In defending a ban on firearms at nuclear power plants, the government would fare best if it produced evidence of historical firearm restrictions at water mills, smelters, or munition stockpiles. Yet even in the absence of such evidence, courts would do Bruin no favors to pretend that it is impossible to identify the shared principle with earlier sensitive places restrictions. Is there something about a nuclear power plant that implies the general right to armed self-defense might temporarily dwindle there? The threat of radioactive cataclysm, we think, carries that implication. So, they developed this generalized standard or test for what could be a sensitive place. And then they immediately said, but also other things could be sensitive places, like nuclear power plants. So I don't know. And they did explicitly write about how, they understand other courts are going to probably look at this decision when they're considering the constitutionality of sensitive places beyond public transit bans. One of the more expansive standards for sensitive places, I think, but also one that does, that where they're, I think, at least trying to in good faith grapple with what the Supreme Court has said on this. I'm sure there are a lot of gun rights activists who don't agree with their conclusions here, but these, I think, both of these opinions are ones where they didn't take shortcuts of just saying, well, dicta implies this from the Supreme Court or that. They went a little more in depth about trying to understand the standard and apply it. Whether they applied it properly is a question for the Supreme Court itself, if it ever gets around to taking any of these Bruin response law cases.
Right, which is, to me, the big point from both of these is that pretty shortly after Bruin, we had at least assurances from someone like Justice Alito that was said, is this an interlocutory pot? Their classic line about not taking things on the preliminary injunction stage, which is fine, but they said, we're going to keep a close eye on this because we just decided Bruin. And then several years have now gone by where they have
3 years.
continue to not take those up. So courts are to some extent flying blind. They have some guidance from the Supreme Court, obviously, on the right to bear arms publicly and even references to sensitive places, but they're crafting their own doctrines in the absence of Supreme Court standard setting in this realm of Second Amendment law. So this is just, I think, the natural result you're going to continue to see until you have a once and for all decision about how to handle sensitive places.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that the Supreme Court agrees with some of these things. Maybe the Seventh Circuit standard more so than the Third. I mean, because one of the issues, obviously, these burn response laws is that you end up in a situation in some of these states, especially because of the default swap provisions. Apologies. Which, to be fair, are being struck down in most of these laws, and those are the most expansive new restrictions on gun carry from any of these sensitive places restrictions. But the issue does become at a certain point with how if you have enough of these gun-free zones that even if you got the permit that the Supreme Court said you have a right to, it may be almost useless in practice if everything is a gun-free zone, right? So you would think the Supreme Court is going to step in at some point and address this issue. But yeah, despite what Alito had said very, very early on in the broom response legal fight, where he praised the very first ruling against New York's new sensitive places restrictions, which blocked pretty much all of them, right? If I recall correctly. He praised that decision, and then the court has never intervened since. Now, they claim that they're waiting for the right moment to do that, or for the cases to get to the right point of legal development. And that may well be the case, although we've obviously seen the Supreme Court move much more quickly on lots of other issues, especially recently, without even necessarily developing. It's caused a lot of consternation in the lower courts about how they've been handling some of the shadow docket stuff. They've not found it necessary to do similar quick action on gun rights. And we don't know when they will address any of these questions. But like you said, in the absence of further guidance from the Supreme Court, this is how things are developing in the lower courts, and not necessarily always. Sometimes you look at a ruling and it's pretty obvious that the court didn't want to put a lot of effort into it, I guess I would say. And I wouldn't say that was the case with either of these decisions. So just something to keep in mind. And there are a number of points made in both of these decisions that are, worth considering and grappling with, I think, if you're looking at these things seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting away from some of our stories and some of our newsletter links as we wrap up here, we have an interesting write-up from Reason Magazine about a phenomenon that you actually identified on social media last week, and that is the fact that at this point now we have every single significant major national gun rights group that has publicly spoken out in opposition to what was floated as sort of a trial balloon from the Department of Justice, reportedly, that it was considering a ban on transgender individuals from purchasing or possessing firearms. And so it's sort of striking to see within the week of that news breaking, every single gun rights group coming out and voicing their opposition to a Trump administration, at least a reported Trump administration initiative.
Yeah, it feels like a trial balloon that got shot down right away, although we don't have any word from the Department of Justice on what their internal considerations are now after the pushback against this. Not necessarily surprising, right? Because what they're proposing, at least what these DOJ officials were discussing, is a blanket ban on people owning firearms without, it sounded like, without any kind of due process. And so the gun rights groups should be, it was consistent for them to be opposed to something like that. And So they all were opposed to that idea right off the bat. NRA, GOA, SAF, everybody. We discussed this a bit on last week's interview podcast with Costas Morris from the Second Amendment Foundation. But yes, just to be totally clear, that this was a unified pushback from the gun rights groups, which hasn't always been the case, right? We saw that with the DC federal takeover. Many of the gun rights groups came out against the ATF patrolling streets and some of these gun seizures, especially ones that were related to simple possession crimes like carrying without a permit or possessing an unregistered firearm. If there was no other aggravating crime, that was something that a number of gun rights groups had spoken out about, but not everyone, including the NRA, hadn't spoken out about that. And if anything, the NRA has been supportive of President Trump's takeover efforts in DC, the policing takeover. And so, yes, in this case, you saw a much more unified opposition to at least the trial balloon or the anonymous comments from the Department of Justice on this front.
Certainly. And then we also have a story from the Tampa Bay Times about a pretty big ruling came out of a Florida state court. It was a state appeals court that struck down its ban on open carry. This has been a source of consternation amongst gun rights advocates down there in Florida because Florida is one of the only triple red states. I think it might be the only triple red state that actually bans open carry outright. And we now have a state appeals court saying that does not fly and that's unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those areas where Florida has stricter gun laws than most people realize. And but a lot of gun rights activists there, certainly, and they've just got a win on this from most. There's another thing where, I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast knows, but most Americans don't understand that open carry is constitutional or legal. You could certainly, the people in this case, and I suppose the judge in this case, are arguing that it's also constitutionally protected, but it's definitely legal in the vast majority of states. And so it's something that's obviously fallen out of fashion as far as what most people who carry a firearm do. Like that most people want to conceal carry, not open carry, in our modern culture. But really, open carry was much more common back when these laws were first considered. So, interesting to see. It's been a while since I've remember hearing of a open carry victory in court, though, too. So that's kind of interesting to see as well.
It is unique, and there's also some unique political angles to this because, as I mentioned, this has been a source of consternation for gun rights folks down there for a while. They introduced bills to legalize open carry just about every single session, and they never seem to make it through. But in the immediate aftermath of this ruling, you actually saw the Attorney General of Florida and Governor Ron DeSantis both put out statements essentially praising the ruling and strongly signaling that they don't plan to appeal it. So I think that's an interesting development that, no bill has been signed by state officials, but they're also now saying that they aren't going to fight a ruling that achieves the same outcome in the end. So always fascinating to see how the politics works on these sorts of issues.
Yeah, we've kind of seen that with the Trump administration and some of these Biden-era ATF rules where we had thought they were going to use rulemaking to roll them back, but instead, for instance, the pistol brace ban, they've just kind of accepted court rulings against it instead of actively trying to undo it through administrative purposes. So yeah, Florida, I think maybe there's a little bit of a dichotomy between Governor DeSantis and the Attorney General there, who has declined to defend a number of these gun laws in court. And then the legislature, who has not gone through actually repealing them. So, perhaps the Republicans in control of the legislature don't want to take these votes, but they also don't want to be out there. I think they may be happy to see this go away through the courts, as you mentioned, instead of trying to, spending political capital on it in the legislature. But it is an interesting dynamic that's how it's turning out down in increasingly red Florida.
Yeah. And then the final link we want to touch on before we wrap up here is actually a court decision, a federal district court decision in Illinois. So Illinois is one of the handful of states, typically blue states, that have their own state-level ban on so-called suppressors or silencers. And this was a court challenge to that state ban. And the judge in this case ruled similar to what we've seen in previous rulings on this topic that we've covered, where the judge ruled that suppressors are not even arms considered by the Second Amendment, and therefore it is constitutional for the state of Illinois to ban them.
Yeah, similar ruling to what we saw in the Fifth Circuit recently. And actually, we just had some news in that Fifth Circuit case, the Peterson case, that we've spent a lot of time looking at and covering, because the panel in that case had withdrawn their opinion and the DOJ had changed its positions, at least somewhat, on suppressors and whether they're protected, but not necessarily on the constitutionality of the NFA in particular. And so the Firearms Policy Coalition has now appealed that ruling, because if you recall, the Peterson case, what ended up happening with that, despite what some people had read into I'd seen some commentators read it a lot into the withdrawing of that initial opinion. So the panel there had upheld the NFA and said silencers and suppressors aren't arms, so they don't enjoy any Second Amendment protections. So the NFA is constitutional, or it doesn't violate the Second Amendment at least. And then the DOJ had changed its position because administrations had changed, and the DOJ was not necessarily saying that they are arms, but that they are accessories that are useful to exercising the right to keep and bear arms. Right? They effectuate that, and so they enjoy some level of Second Amendment protection, similar to commercial sales are not literally protected by the Second Amendment in the sense that it doesn't write out the right to sell arms, but it's it's an implied protection, and so the DOJ had changed its position to say suppressors get some level of protection from the Second Amendment, but also that it's like a lower level of protection, and so you can regulate them in the way that the NFA does, because it's not a total ban. It's a tax and registration scheme. And that is essentially what the panel adopted, that viewpoint. Now, they did it by saying, we're going to assume without deciding that silencers are arms. I'm using the term interchangeably here. Obviously, silencers, it's the legal term and the one that the inventor used, but also a bit of a marketing term. Those suppressors don't actually silence, or silencers don't actually silence gunfire. They suppress the sound, and that's why most people in the gun rights world and the industry prefer to call them suppressors, although not everybody. There's plenty of companies that still have silencer in the name, including Silencer Co., probably the largest silencer maker out there. But I digress. Just to explain the language there, I'm sure I've done it before on the show, but always a good idea to, I think, do it again to avoid the kind of comments that I might see otherwise here. But in the end, the panel said, we're going to assume without deciding that suppressors, silencers are arms, and then go from there. And they ended up with the same essentially the same calculation that DOJ had made, where even if they're arms, they're not, the NFA isn't a violation of the Second Amendment because it's just a tax and registration scheme. The Supreme Court said that, shall issue permitting is acceptable in the case of bearing arms. So they essentially said it's also acceptable in the case of keeping arms. And so FPC, the plaintiffs in this case, don't like that ruling, of course, because they believe that the NFA is a violation of the Second Amendment, and they ended up filing for an appeal in that case to the en banc court, meaning the full Fifth Circuit court, instead of straight to the Supreme Court. So that's the latest on Peterson. Shares some legal similarities to what's going on with this case in Illinois over the same. Although the Illinois case is a little bit, that's where the change in position from the Department of Justice actually may come into play. We've seen this with the more recent lawsuit in New Jersey challenging their suppressor ban. But DOJ's position change doesn't affect anything as far as the federal law goes, as far as the National Firearms Act goes, but it may affect some of these state laws, or at least that's what the position implies, because essentially what DOJ is saying that is, yes, suppressors are protected, but the NFA itself is not an infringement on the Second Amendment rights. However, total bans on their possession may be, and that's where these state law challenges come in. And we're seeing now, in this case at least, that hasn't changed the mind of some of these lower courts yet, but it'll be interesting to see what happens as these state bans, the challenges to them, move further up the line in federal court.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Certainly a difference between the NFA's regulations and an outright ban on something that the DOJ says at least has some limited protection under the Second Amendment.
But yeah, I think that's all we've got, though, for as far as news goes this week. I actually got a message from David French while we were filming here, and so he may have to reschedule. I'll see. We may have a different guest. We'll see. Hopefully he'll still be able to join us. I thought his piece on this whole assassination was actually very good, and gives us a lot to discuss. But if not, I'll do my best to find another guest of that has as much insight as possible as well. But yeah, I mean, you got anything going on this weekend? Any good plans?
Yeah, well, it's fun and actually gun related, but also work. So tomorrow is, I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but every year my full-time job, we host a big gathering. We call it our alcohol, tobacco, and firearms party, where we host some of our biggest supporters out, and we go take them to shoot sporting clays out at a facility arranged that we partner with out east in Colorado, and then serve them lunch, and it's catered, and people can smoke cigars and have beers and that sort of a thing. So I have to work that. Unfortunately, I may get to shoot some clays at the end after everybody else, but I'm mostly there to interact with the folks that support us. So I'll be out there bright and early on a Saturday, setting up. So
nice. Well, I'm sure that'll be a good time. At least we also, of course, have more football this weekend. We just saw what the Packers just kind of took apart the Commanders there. I'm sure Mike Williver of the Active Self-Protection News podcast that I am on most weeks, he's been away, but we'll be back next week. I'm sure he was not very happy about how that game went. But we'll see where this Eagles-Chiefs game ends up. They suspended Jalen Carter for spitting on Dak Prescott, or for standing his ground is what I would call it. Returning fire. But they suspended him, but they counted the game that he missed against the Cowboys as that suspension. So he will be back, which will I think make our defense a lot better. But the Chiefs, while they lost their first game and now I think are back in last place for the first time in their division in quite a long time, right?
Yeah, we're enjoying that over here in Broncos country, that's for sure.
They are still, of course, a very good team, I think, overall. So we'll see how this Super Bowl rematch goes. I hope it goes as well as the Super Bowl did. We'll find out. All right. Well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.
No, the devil